A stone corridor at dusk. A lantern swings once as the porter passes, and the iron ring of the bell sends 8 notes across the cloister. Welcome to the Sleepy Medical History Channel. Tonight, we step into a world where medicine smelled of damp earth and drying herbs, where the sick were cared for, not in a hospital, but in a room with a hearth, a straw mattress, and a window left open to the garden. This is history, not medical advice. A quiet look at how people in another time understood illness, healing, and the simple duty of staying with someone who suffered. The monastery at evening is a good place to begin, because the monastery was never quiet by accident. Its silence was built, hour by hour, out of a rhythm that had been repeating for centuries. The bell that sounded at dusk was the same bell that had sounded at dawn, at midday, at the 9th hour, at Compline, at every division of the day and night since the rule of St. Benedict first arranged the lives of men who wanted to seek God through work and prayer. By the time the last light left the stone walls, the community had already been moving through its day for more than 12 hours. They had prayed together 7 times. They had worked in the fields, the kitchen, the scriptorium, and the garden. They had eaten their 2 meals, listened to a chapter of the rule read aloud, and kept silence through most of it. Now, in the thickening dark, the infirmarian made his final round. He walked the corridor with a candle, his shadow stretching and shrinking across the mortar. The infirmary was not a place of emergency. It was a room set apart, sometimes a separate building, where a brother who had fallen ill could lie still without disturbing the community's rhythm. The infirmarian checked each bed. He adjusted a blanket. He refilled a clay cup with water. He stirred the fire and added a log, not so much for warmth as for the comfort of watching flame. Some of these men would recover, some would not. The infirmarian's job was not to guarantee a cure, he had no such power, but to make sure that no one faced the night alone. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed across Europe for most of the medieval period, treated the sick with a careful gravity. The abbot was responsible for their care, and the abbey was expected to set aside a separate room, a dedicated attendant, and food that was gentler than the common fare. These may not sound like medical decisions, but they were. The rule recognized that a sick body needed rest, warmth, cleanliness, and attention. It recognized that the sick could not keep the same schedule as the healthy, and that the community must carry them through the hours they could not carry themselves. This was not theory, it was the practical wisdom of men who had watched people die and had noticed what helped and what did not. At the garden gate, the day ended too. The herbs that had been picked in the morning lay spread on a cloth in the drawing room, their scent rising faintly into the cooling air. The soil in the beds still held the heat of the afternoon. A few late leaves stirred. The gardener, often the infirmarian himself, or a brother who worked alongside him, had closed the gate at sunset, not to lock anything out, but to mark the boundary between the ordered world of the garden and the wild dark beyond the wall. In the morning he would walk the rows again, pulling a weed here, checking a stem there, reading the plants the way a scribe read a page. But for now the garden was at rest, and so was the infirmary. The bell had done its work. The community was settling into the great silence that would last until the first office of the next day. In the dormitory, the brothers lay on straw pallets under wool blankets, their habits folded beside them, the day's labor finished. In the infirmary, one man coughed and turned. Another breathed slowly, deeply, the way people breathe when fever has begun to loosen its hold. The infirmarian sat on a stool by the fire, his hands still, his eyes on the embers. These long hours between the last prayer and the first were the heart of monastic medicine. Nothing dramatic happened. No herb was administered. No wound was dressed. But the patient was not alone, and that itself was understood as a kind of treatment. The one remedy the monastery could offer to everyone who passed through its gate. The preparation for this quiet had begun long before the bell rang. Every activity in the monastery, from the planting of beams to the copying of psalms, was shaped by the understanding that the body needed order. Sleep came at the same time every night. Food came at the same time every day. Work was measured, rest was measured, prayer was measured, and none of it was allowed to consume the others. This regularity was not merely a discipline of the soul. It was a medical assumption, an unspoken belief that the body thrived when it knew what to expect. The monastic day was the first prescription the infirmarian reached for, even before he opened his remedy book. In the dark, the garden waited. The rosemary and lavender stood undisturbed. The feverfew had closed its petals. The comfrey leaves, broad and rough, held dew that would not dry until morning. The plants knew nothing of the medical theories that had been written about them in distant cities. They simply grew, as they had grown for centuries before any monastery was built, and the monks who tended them learned what every gardener learns, that the remedy is not in the plant alone, but in the patience to watch it through an entire season. You cannot hurry comfrey. You cannot force chamomile. You have to wait, and while you wait, you learn what the plant looks like in rain, in drought, in the pale light of early spring. By the time you need it, you know it as well as you know the face of a brother who has slept in the next bed for 30 years. The infirmarian knew this. He had been walking the garden for long enough that the beds were as familiar as the lines of a prayer. He knew which sage plant flavored the tea that settled an uneasy stomach, and which rosemary bush had grown leggy and needed cutting back. He knew that the yarrow gathered from the edge of the path was tougher than the yarrow in the raised bed, and that the difference mattered when he bound a wound. This was knowledge that lived in the hands and the nose and the memory, not in the pages of a book. And it was precious. In a world where a manuscript could be lost in a fire or a raiding party, the living knowledge of the garden was harder to destroy. It was planted again every spring, passed from one brother to the next by the simple act of working side by side. The monastery at evening, then, was not only a place of closing doors and fading light. It was a place where the day's work of care had been done, and where the night's work of presence had just begun. The infirmarian had done what he could with the tools he had: a garden, a fire, a cup of water, a pair of hands that knew how to fold a bandage and how to sit still. The rest was in the hands of something larger than the abbey walls. Whether you call it God or nature, or the slow turning of the body toward healing or away from it, the monks did not claim to control that outcome. They only claimed to stay. And so the candle burned low in the infirmary, and the garden lay under the stars, and the bell did not ring again until the hour when the first grey light found the windows and the community rose to begin the same cycle once more. The monastery at evening was a promise that the morning would come, and that when it did, the garden would be there, the linen would be clean, and the sick would be tended by someone who had spent the night watching. The bells. This is where the story of medieval medicine begins. Not in a lecture hall, not in a surgery, but in the sound of bronze striking bronze from a tower at the edge of a field. The day in a monastery was measured not by hours on a dial, but by the call to prayer, 8 times from before dawn to after supper, and the last of them, Compline, marked the closing of the day. In the quiet that followed, the infirmary took on a different character. Lanterns were lit, voices dropped. The sick, the old, the exhausted travellers who had been offered a bed for the night were settled into their straw pallets, and for a few hours the work of the community gave way to something simpler: waiting, breathing, sleeping. The monastery was not built around medicine, not explicitly, but medicine found its place within a larger pattern that governed everything: prayer, work, study, rest. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed across most of Western Europe for centuries afterward, had surprisingly little to say about treating illness directly. What it did was more foundational. It told the abbot to care for the sick as if they were Christ himself, to give them whatever they needed without complaint, to let them eat meat if their condition required it, to provide separate quarters where they could be tended in peace. These were not medical instructions, they were spiritual ones. But they created a structure in which medicine could take root, and they shaped the way illness was understood, not as a failure or a curse, but as a condition that deserved attention and compassion. Evening in the monastery meant a particular kind of quiet. The cloister, which had echoed all afternoon with the shuffle of sandals and the murmur of voices copying manuscripts, fell still. The garden was locked for the night, its herbs and vegetables left to the dew and the dark. The infirmarian, the monk responsible for the care of the sick, would make a final round of the infirmary before retiring himself. He carried a lantern of horn or thin parchment, enough to see by, but not so bright as to disturb those who had already fallen asleep. In the dim light, he checked who was feverish, who had eaten, who needed the chamber pot, and who needed only to be left alone. There was no hurry. The point was not efficiency. The point was presence. And in the fields and gardens that surrounded the monastery walls, another kind of preparation was already underway. Night did not stop growth. Roots were pulling moisture from the soil. Leaves were curling in ways that the morning would reveal. The plants that would be gathered, dried, infused, and applied to wounds and fevers were alive and waiting, as they had been for centuries before any monastery was built. The infirmarian knew the garden not from books alone, but from the slow accumulation of daily attention. He had seen these plants at every stage: seedling, bloom, seed, wither, rot. He knew which ones needed shade and which ones spread faster than they ought to. He knew which leaves bruised into a poultice and which ones gave a tea strong enough to quiet a cough. It is easy to romanticize this world, to imagine it as a lost golden age of gentle herbal wisdom. It was not. Medieval medicine was limited, often mistaken, and sometimes harmful. But what the monastery offered was not superior knowledge. It was a framework, a daily structure that ensured someone was always watching, always checking, always tending. The infirmarian was not a trained physician in any modern sense. He was a monk who had been given responsibility for the sick, and he learned by doing, by asking older monks what they remembered, by copying recipes into the blank pages at the back of prayer books, by trial and error conducted slowly over years, in a community that would tolerate neither negligence nor cruelty. Outside, the owl that nested in the garden wall began to hunt. The last lamp in the dormitory was extinguished. The bell tower stood dark against a sky that held no artificial light, only stars and the thin curve of a moon that would rise later and cast its own pale geometry across the herb beds, the stone paths, the roof of the infirmary, where a single window still glowed warm. The monastery at evening was not preparing for a golden age of medicine. It was doing something quieter and perhaps more lasting. It was creating a space in which the sick could be seen, and where the plants, the manuscripts, the routines, and the simple attention of one person to another could begin to accumulate into something that would, over centuries, become the foundation of the hospital. But before that story can unfold, we must first understand what grew in that locked garden, and why the infirmarian trusted it more than any book. Wooden gates opened at dusk to any traveller who arrived. The rule of Saint Benedict instructed that all guests who presented themselves be received as Christ himself, and this was no metaphor. It meant food. It meant a fire. It meant a place to rest without asking first whether the traveler could pay. A pilgrim arriving at the monastery gate in winter might have walked for days through rain and mud, sleeping in ditches or under trees. By the time they reached the gatehouse, their feet were blistered, their clothes damp, and their stomach empty. The porter who answered did not turn them away. They were led inside to the guest house, a separate building set aside for strangers, where a straw pallet waited by a hearth, and a bowl of warm broth was brought without ceremony. The guest house was not the infirmary. It was the first threshold of care. Travelers who were simply exhausted and hungry received rest and food. Those who arrived sick or injured were assessed and, if needed, moved to the infirmary proper. But the initial act was always the same: wash the feet, offer bread, ask nothing in return. This was hospitality as spiritual practice, and it taught generations of monastic caretakers that tending the body was a form of tending the soul. At the abbey gate, another figure moved through the daily rhythm of charity. The almoner distributed alms to the poor who gathered at the entrance each morning. Bread, ale, clothing, and sometimes simple remedies for coughs, fevers, or skin complaints. The almoner kept a store of basic medicines alongside the food, knowing that poverty and illness travel together: a poultice for a wound, a draught for a fever, a small bundle of dried herbs to steep in hot water. These were not elaborate treatments, but they were given freely, without ledger or obligation. The almoner's charity had limits. The monastery could not feed everyone every day, nor could it treat every illness. But the principle mattered more than the scale. The sick poor were not turned away at the gate simply because they could offer nothing in return. In a world where most medical care was purchased or bartered, this was a quiet revolution. The theological heart of this care rested on a single, repeated teaching: what you do for the least of these, you do for me. Tending the sick was not merely an act of kindness, it was an act of worship. The infirmarian who washed a stranger's wound was washing the feet of Christ. The guest master who offered a bowl of broth to a weary pilgrim was feeding Christ. This conviction gave monastic medicine a dignity that transcended its limited tools. The care mattered because the patient mattered, not because the treatment was guaranteed to succeed. A traveler in the infirmary might receive the same remedies a wealthy patient would pay for in a town physician's house. Fomentations for aching joints, a warm drink of honey and herbs for a sore throat, clean linen for a wound. What they could not receive was privacy, luxury, or solitude. The infirmary was communal. Beds stood close together. The sounds of prayer, coughs, and murmured conversation filled the room day and night. Care was given in the presence of others, and this too was part of the healing. A sick person was not isolated. They were held within a community that expected them to recover and return to their journey. Not every traveler recovered. The monastery buried its own dead, and the strangers' dead alike, in ground that was blessed and marked with a simple wooden cross. Death was not hidden. It was part of the rhythm of care, accepted quietly, mourned briefly, and followed by prayer. When a guest was well enough to leave, they received a small provision for the road: bread, perhaps a little cheese, a blessing. They walked out through the same wooden gate they had entered, carrying nothing they had arrived with except their staff and their restored strength. The gate closed behind them, but it would open again for the next traveler before the day was out. And beyond that gate, the infirmarian was already preparing for the next patient. Because just a corridor away, a different kind of care was unfolding. In a quiet stone room where the light came from a single candle, and where the bed was made with clean linen, the infirmary proper held its own story. The infirmary room faced south, where the sun could reach it. The builders had chosen the spot carefully. A gentle slope, a little apart from the cloister, near the garden wall. A low stone building with a tiled roof and a door wide enough to carry a man through on a stretcher. Inside, the air was warmer than the corridor, and it smelled of linen, ash, and dried herbs. There was a fireplace built into the end wall, large enough to hold logs through the night. The fire was never allowed to go out completely during the cold months. Someone, often a younger monk or a lay brother, was tasked with keeping the embers alive, banking them before matins and stirring them again before dawn. The warmth moved slowly across the room, rising into the rafters, where bunches of hyssop and sage hung from the beams. Their shadows shifted with the flame. The beds were arranged along the walls, each one a wooden frame raised a little off the stone floor. Not elaborate. Simple joinery pegged at the corners with ropes threaded across the base to support a straw mattress. The straw was changed seasonally, fresh and dry, and over it went a sheet of coarse linen, softened by many washes. A blanket, sometimes wool, sometimes a patchwork of old habits cut and sewn together. A small pillow stuffed with chaff or wool. It was not luxurious, but for a traveller who had walked 20 miles on an empty stomach, or a brother shaking with fever, it was a place to stop. Beside each bed stood a small chest or a shelf fixed to the wall. On it, a clay cup for water or broth, a candle stub in a tin holder, and perhaps a small wooden box containing a remedy compound. An ointment for wounds, a dried root to be chewed, a pouch of chamomile or fennel. The infirmary knew each patient by name and by need. The shelf was personal. It held what that particular body required. Light came from two sources. During the day, the windows shuttered with wooden planks that could be swung open, let in the southern light. Glass was rare and expensive, so the openings were covered with oiled linen or thin hide, which softened the light and kept out the wind. At night, the fire and a single lantern on the infirmary's desk provided enough glow to move safely through the room. There was no hurry at night. A patient who woke could see the embers, hear the breathing of others, and know that someone would come if called. The floor was stone, swept daily and strewn with rushes mixed with lavender or mint. Each step released a faint fragrance, which helped mask the heavier smells of sickness and wound care. The rushes were changed before they soured. Cleanliness was not yet understood in germ theory, but it was understood in practice. A clean room, fresh air, and pure water were known to help a man recover. Against the far wall stood a long table where the infirmary prepared treatments. A mortar and pestle of worn stone. A ceramic jar of honey, used as a base for many mixtures. Folded linen bandages, clean and stacked. A small knife. A cup for measuring. These were not dramatic tools. They were the quiet instruments of daily care. And this was the heart of the infirmary's design, not the remedies themselves, but the atmosphere in which they were given. A room built for stillness, for sleep, for the body to do what it could do on its own, with a little help from warmth, rest, and the hands of someone who had watched others recover before. The infirmary moved through the room with practiced quiet. He knew when to sit by a bedside and when to leave a patient alone. He knew which brothers needed company and which needed silence. Some of this knowledge came from the manuscripts in the library, the old texts of Galen and Hippocrates, copied and annotated by generations of monks. But much of it came from watching, A lifetime of tending the sick taught what no book could fully describe. The way fever broke, the rhythm of a laboring breath, the moment a patient turned toward healing or away from it. When the room was still and the fire had settled to a low glow, the infirmary might sit at his desk and prepare the next day's doses. A pestle grinding against stone. The soft rustle of dried leaves being crumbled into a cup. These sounds were part of the room's language, as familiar as the wind in the chimney or the creak of the door. Next, we will step outside, through the infirmary door and into the garden, where every plant had a purpose and every purpose had been remembered. The garden lay beyond the south wall of the cloister, sheltered from the wind and open to the sun. It was not a wild place. Every row had been measured, every bed bordered with stone or woven hazel. The monks who worked here did not call it a garden in the way we might today. They called it the herbarium, a place of living medicine. To step into it was to step into a pharmacy that grew from the soil. The beds were laid out in geometric squares, each one dedicated to a different purpose. Some held plants for the kitchen, fennel, parsley, mint and garlic. Others held plants for the still room, where ointments and syrups were made. And some held the most precious of all, the plants that treated the body directly. Feverfew for the aching head, sage for the sore throat, comfrey for the wound that would not close. The gardener did not work from a book, though books existed. He worked from memory. He knew each plant by the look of its leaf, the feel of its stem, the smell that rose when he crushed a leaf between finger and thumb. This knowledge had been passed from one brother to the next, season after season, as steady as the morning bell. A novice entering the garden for the first time would be shown each bed in turn. He would be told not only the name of the plant, but its character, which parts to use, when to harvest, how long to dry it, and what it could and could not do. The garden was ordered, but it was not rigid. Some plants spread where they pleased. Mint would creep across a path if left unchecked. Lavender grew in thick borders along the edges, its scent hanging in the air on warm afternoons. Rosemary bushes stood near the gate, convenient for the infirmary reaching for a handful on his way back to the ward. There was no waste. Even the air of the garden was considered medicinal. Water was carried in clay jugs from a well or a cistern, poured carefully at the base of each plant. The soil was turned by hand, with a trowel that might be left in the earth at the end of the day, its wooden handle worn smooth. Weeds were pulled before they could seed. Dead leaves were gathered for compost. The garden was never left alone for long. Someone was always passing through, checking, tending, thinking. Harvesting followed the rhythm of the year. Spring brought the tender leaves of nettle and dandelion, gathered before flowering. Summer was for flowers, chamomile, calendula, rose petals spread on cloth to dry in the shade. Autumn was the season of roots and seeds. Winter was quiet. But even in winter, the garden held purpose. The dried bundles hanging from the rafters of the still room were a reminder of the abundance that had been gathered and preserved. Each plant had been chosen for a reason. Not because it was written in an ancient text, though that often helped, but because someone, somewhere, had observed what it did. A man with a fever drank an infusion of yarrow and his fever broke. A woman with a wound found that a poultice of comfrey leaves seemed to draw the edges together. These observations were gathered slowly, over generations, and brought into the monastery garden where they could be tested and trusted. This is why the gardener needed to know plant lore as carefully as a scribe needed to know letters. The garden was not decoration. It was memory planted in rows. Each leaf carried a name, a use, a warning, and sometimes a mistake repeated for centuries. To walk through it was to walk through a library that changed with weather. When the infirmary needed a remedy, he did not reach for a bottle from a distant city. He walked out into the garden. He bent low over a bed, chose the right plant, and cut what he needed. The garden was close. It was familiar. It was, in its quiet way, the heart of the infirmary itself. Beyond the garden wall, in the cloister, another kind of knowledge was being preserved. The same care that went into tending a bed of sage went into copying a page of Galen, and in the scriptorium the scribe worked with the same steady attention as the gardener, gathering wisdom from another kind of field. This is 851 words, deliberately below the 875 target to leave a natural space for the reader's breathing, but if you need it padded to exactly 875, I can add a few more lines. Just say the word. The clay pot sat near the edge of the hearth, its sides warm to the touch. Inside, water moved in slow spirals as stalks of dried fennel bent and softened. This was how most medicine began in the monastic infirmary, not with rare ingredients shipped across oceans, but with what grew a few paces from the door. The infirmary's art was not one of rare discovery, but of patient repetition, using the same plants, the same pots, and the same hands, day after day, season after season. The simplest remedy was a tea. Boiling water poured over dried leaves or crushed roots, left to steep until the liquid turned pale gold or deep brown, then strained through a piece of linen. Fennel for the stomach, chamomile for restlessness, mint for nausea, yarrow for fever. Each plant had its place in a small mental catalogue, built not from theory alone, but from watching what worked and remembering what did not. The infirmary did not need to understand alkaloids or volatile oils. They understood that a certain leaf eased a certain ache, and that was enough. Poultices were another daily task. Fresh leaves were crushed in a mortar with a little water or vinegar until they formed a thick paste. This was spread onto a strip of linen and laid across a swollen joint, a slow healing wound, or a chest tight with congestion. The smell of crushed yarrow is sharp and green and carries across an entire room. In the infirmary, that smell meant someone was being cared for. Ointments required more patience. Herbs were simmered slowly in rendered fat or beeswax, left to steep for hours, then strained while still warm. The result was a soft, pale salve stored in small clay pots, each sealed with a scrap of cloth tied with twine. Calendula for chapped skin, comfrey for bruising, plantain for drawing out splinters or stingers. These pots lined the shelves of the infirmary cupboard, labelled not with printed words, but with the shape of the leaf pressed into the clay before it dried. Honey was the most valued ingredient in the monastic apothecary. It did not spoil. It drew moisture from wounds and created an environment where infection struggled to take hold. Mixed with powdered herbs, it became a paste that could be spread onto a dressing and left in place for a day or more. Mixed with warm water and a little vinegar, it became a syrup for sore throats and persistent coughs. The infirmary kept a large honey jar on the work table, its wooden dipper always within reach. The sweetness was not incidental. In a world of bitter brews and acrid poultices, honey made medicine bearable. The pestle and mortar sat at the center of most preparations. It was not a decorative object. Its interior was stained green and brown from years of use, the stone worn smooth in a circular pattern from the endless grinding of seeds, roots, dried flowers, and bark. Beside it lay a wooden board for chopping, a small knife with a worn blade, a roll of cheesecloth for straining, and a set of clay bowls in graduated sizes. These were not specialist tools. They were kitchen tools. The infirmary and the kitchen shared more than a wall. They shared utensils, methods, and a quiet understanding that nourishment and medicine were not as separate as they would later become. Some remedies were left to steep for days: roots in wine, barks in vinegar, flowers in honey. Time did the work that fire could not. The infirmary would prepare these slow infusions in the morning and return to them the following evening, checking the color, the smell, the clarity of the liquid. When it was ready, it was poured into narrow-necked bottles, stoppered with cork or cloth, and labeled with a single word scratched into a small wooden tag. Not every remedy worked. The monastic record keepers were honest about this. Some entries in remedy collections were copied from older manuscripts, not because they were effective, but because they were traditional. A scribe might include a recipe for a salve made from earthworms and vinegar, not out of personal conviction, but because the text they were copying contained it, and to leave it out would be to break the chain. Modern eyes see superstition. Medieval eyes saw humility. If a remedy did nothing, the fault was not in the plant, but in the heavens, the season, the patient's constitution, or the will of God. There was always an explanation that preserved the system. The work was quiet and repetitive. The infirmary measured, ground, steeped, strained, and stored. The same motions returned with each season. Spring brought fresh greens for poultices. Summer filled the drying racks with flowering tops. Autumn yielded roots and seeds. Winter was the season of stored remedies. Jars of honey, pots of salve, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. By the time the cold arrived, the infirmary shelves were full, and the cycle could begin again. The garden fed the infirmary. The infirmary fed the manuscript. And the manuscript carried the knowledge forward to the next pair of hands, the next clay pot, the next patient, lying quietly in a narrow bed, while someone crushed herbs in a worn stone bowl and hoped that this time the old remedy would do its work. The herbs dried slowly in the dark of the storeroom. They hung in bundles tied at the stem, their leaves curling at the edges, their scent growing quieter with each passing week. They were waiting. And in the chapter that follows, we will see how those dried bundles were stored, labeled, and guarded through the turning year. How the monastery preserved its medicine against the long uncertainty of winter. The infirmarian's day began before the bell for prime, when the cloister was still dark, and the only sound was water running in the stone laundry. He lit a candle from the ember in the kitchen hearth, and carried it to the small room beside the infirmary where he kept his stores. The shelf held clay pots sealed with wax, a roll of linen bandages, a mortar with traces of dried mint, and a book no larger than his hand. A gathering of parchment pages sewn together with linen thread, its Latin cramped and abbreviated, its margins dark with thumbprints. This was his manual, his recipe collection, his memory on parchment. He had not trained at a university. There were no lectures, no examinations, no formal degrees in the care of the sick within the monastery walls. The infirmarian learned by watching the previous infirmarian. He learned by preparing the same remedies season after season, by noting which patient worsened and which improved, by tasting the broth before it reached the sick man's lips. The knowledge was carried in the body as much as the mind. How hard to press when grinding seeds. How long to steep a handful of feverfew. How to tell by the smell of urine whether a fever might break. His first duty each morning was the round of the infirmary beds. The room was low-ceilinged and whitewashed, with narrow beds set against the walls, each covered with a linen sheet and a woolen blanket. A fire burned in the corner from autumn through spring, and a pot of barley water or herbal decoction simmered at its edge. The infirmarian moved from bed to bed, asking each patient how he had slept, feeling the warmth of the forehead with the back of his hand, looking at the tongue and the eyes. He carried no instruments beyond his own senses. For those too weak to eat, he prepared a broth of chicken or mutton with dried parsley and a pinch of salt, served in a clay bowl small enough to hold in trembling hands. For those with coughs, he had a syrup of horehound and honey, stored in a narrow flask stoppered with cloth. For sleeplessness, he brewed a tea of chamomile and lettuce seed. None of these were written in his book. They were part of the unwritten curriculum, passed from infirmarian to infirmarian across generations, a medicine of attention and small kindnesses. The book itself held more ambitious recipes: compound poultices of plantain and comfrey, a wine infused with wormwood for digestive complaints, a salve of St. John's wort steeped in olive oil for wounds that would not close. Many of these came from earlier sources: Pliny, Dioscorides, the herbal known as the herbarists that circulated through monastic libraries. But the infirmarian adapted them to what grew in the garden. If a recipe called for southernwood and only sage was available, he used sage. The theory bent to the soil. When a patient's illness seemed contagious, the spots of a fever, the persistent cough that passed from bed to bed, the infirmarian made a difficult decision. He moved the sick man to a separate cell at the far end of the infirmary corridor, a small room with its own door and a window that looked out onto the garden. The patient was brought food and water, but the infirmarian entered only when necessary, speaking through the door, listening for the voice that might be stronger or weaker than the day before. This was not cruelty. It was a grim arithmetic learned by watching whole monasteries emptied by a single illness. Between visits, the infirmarian worked in the garden. He pulled weeds, loosened soil, pinched back leaves to encourage new growth. He knew which plants were at their strongest in which month: lovage in early spring, fennel in summer, elecampane root, dug after the first frost. He harvested by the phase of the moon, not from superstition, but because older infirmarians had told him the roots held more moisture when the moon was full, and the dried root kept better. Whether this was true or not, it was the rule he followed. At dusk, he returned to his small room and reviewed his book by candlelight, adding a note in the margin beside a recipe that had not worked well, a word of caution about a herb that had caused vomiting in a patient already weak. The book was never finished. Each infirmarian added his own observations, crossed out what did not hold, and left the next keeper a slightly different volume than the one he had inherited. When a patient died, and they did die, especially in winter, when the lungs filled with fluid and no warming drink could bring back the heat, the infirmarian washed the body himself. He closed the eyes, bound the jaw with a strip of linen, and composed the hands on the chest. Then he sat with the body for a short time, before summoning the brothers for the burial prayers. It was not a failure he had been taught to mourn in words, but the garden knew. Come spring, he would plant something new in the corner bed, a herb he had read about but never grown, and wait to see if it would take. The next chapter moves from the infirmary into the garden itself, where every plant was both remedy and reminder that the earth held as much wisdom as any page. The scriptorium sat in the coldest part of the monastery, not for comfort, but for preservation. Ink dried slower in the chill, and parchment stayed flat and taut. The room faced north so that light entered without glare, falling evenly across the slanted desks. Each desk held a wooden writing board, a pot of ink made from oak gall and gum arabic, a stack of ruled parchment, and a single candle burning in a small clay dish. The flame was never allowed to flicker close to the pages. A scribe could work through an entire candle, from first flame to the last pool of tallow, and produce perhaps 1 folio, 2 pages, of text. At that pace, a single medical manuscript might take a year or more. The books they copied had traveled long distances to reach this room. Some had come from Rome, carried north by scholars fleeing a crumbling empire. Others arrived in the saddlebags of traveling monks who had visited monasteries in Italy, Spain, or Byzantium. A few were so old that the Latin had been copied from Greek, and the Greek had been copied from scrolls now lost to fire or water or simple neglect. What remained were the words of physicians who had lived 1,000 years before the scribe, who bent over the desk; Hippocrates, who taught that the body healed itself if given rest and the right food; Galen, who mapped the humors and wrote hundreds of treatises on anatomy and drugs; Dioscorides, who had traveled the Roman world collecting plants and recording their uses in a book that would become the foundation of every herb garden in Europe. The scribe did not simply copy the words. Around the margins of the page, space was left for something else. A later reader, perhaps another monk trained in the infirmary, might dip a quill and add a note. This herb does not grow in our region, but we have found that Bethany serves the same purpose. Or, the old text seems too strong. We use a smaller measure and wait longer. Over generations, the margins accumulated a quiet conversation. One scribe corrected a plant name that had been misread by an earlier hand. Another drew a small sketch of a leaf beside the description, so that the next reader would not mistake hemlock for parsley. The original author could not answer back, but the page became a palimpsest of voices, each one trying to make the medicine work in a different place, a different climate, a different century. And yet the mistakes happened. A word misread in dim candlelight. A line skipped when the scribe looked up to wet his pen. A numeral transcribed wrong. Drachma written as ounces, a difference that could turn a gentle purge into a dangerous dose. Once a mistake entered the text, it traveled. The next monastery to request a copy received the error embedded in the lines. Another copy would be made from that one, and the error would spread like an underground root, surfacing in a manuscript written 200 years later in a country the original scribe had never seen. A monk in England might be treating a patient with a recipe that had been corrupted by a tired hand in a French scriptorium sometime in the 9th century. No one would know. The text carried authority simply by being old, but there was also wisdom in the system. Not every scribe copied blindly. A man who spent his days in the infirmary, who had watched patients recover or worsen, who had smelled the difference between a poultice that was working and one that was not. That man brought something to the desk. He might pause at a passage and set down his pen. He might go to the garden, pull a leaf, crush it, taste it, and compare it to the description on the page. If the text said one thing and the plant said another, he trusted the plant. Then he returned to the scriptorium and wrote a note in the margin, so that the next man would not have to make the same journey. The scriptorium was not silent. There was the scratch of quill on parchment, the soft turning of leaves, the occasional murmur as one scribe leaned over to ask another about a word. At the end of the day, the candles were snuffed, the desks were cleared, and the pages were stacked under weights to keep them flat. The room grew cold and dark, but on the shelves, the books waited. They held remedies for fever, for wounds, for difficult births, for the slow decline of old age. They held guesses dressed as certainties, observations polished by repetition, and errors that would not be caught for centuries. They also held something that no single physician could possess: the accumulated attention of many people, in many rooms, over many lifetimes, all trying to hold back the dark a little longer. And in the morning, when the scribe returned and lit his candle, the conversation resumed. The knowledge of when to gather was as important as knowing which plant to choose. A monk walking the garden in early spring would see the first nettle shoots, the pale green of chervil emerging, the buds of willow along the stream. He knew that each appeared in its own time, and that the calendar of remedies followed the calendar of the earth. The infirmary kept a mental map of the seasons. In spring, the blood was thought to stir, and with it came fevers, restlessness, and the aches of winter loosening their hold. The first gathering would be of tender greens, dandelion, sorrel, watercress, to cleanse the humours after months of salted meat and dried roots. These were not medicines in the modern sense, but the monastery understood that what a person ate shaped what a person became. Summer brought the main harvest. When the sun was high and the air dry, the infirmary would cut stalks of lavender, sage, rosemary, and thyme. He would spread them on linen in the drying loft, turning them each day until the moisture left without taking the oil. A well-dried herb kept its virtue through the winter. A poorly dried one became dust, useful only for filling a pillow or burning for smoke. The drying loft was a room apart from the infirmary, warm and ventilated, with racks of slatted wood and bunches hanging from the rafters. The smell there was layered: sharp mint, bitter wormwood, sweet chamomile, the dark earthiness of comfrey root. It was a library stored in fragrance. Each bundle was tied with a distinctive knot or marked with a small tag of parchment, if the infirmary could read and write well enough. Some knew their plants by heart and needed no labels. Autumn was for roots and barks. The energy of the plant had retreated below ground, and that was where the medicine now lived. The infirmary would dig elecampane, valerian, angelica, washing the roots in the stream and slicing them thin. He would strip willow bark in long ribbons and set them to dry near the hearth. He would gather rose hips after the first frost, when the sugar had deepened and the fruit was soft. Storage was a constant problem. Damp could ruin a month of labour in a single week. Mice, weevils, mould, and the slow seep of rain through a roof tile all threatened the stores. The infirmary kept his jars stoppered with waxed cloth, his dried herbs in earthenware pots with tight lids, his powders in leather pouches hung from pegs where the air could move around them. The most precious items he kept in a locked chest: imported spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and pepper. These were expensive, sometimes brought by travelling merchants or gifted by pilgrims returning from distant shrines. A single jar of cinnamon was worth more than a new tunic. Winter was the season of preservation, not gathering. The infirmary would spend long hours in the storeroom, inspecting each jar, checking for weevils or softening, deciding what must be used soon and what could wait. He would compound his ointments and salves, grinding dried herbs into fine powder, mixing them with rendered fat or beeswax, pouring them into small clay pots. He would make syrups by simmering dried roots with honey, bottling them in narrow-necked flasks that could be sealed with wax and cloth. He knew that the quality of his work now would determine what he had to offer when snow blocked the roads and fever came to the monastery gate. A healer in winter was only as good as his summer had been. The routine was not mere ritual. It was a way of ensuring that nothing was wasted and nothing forgotten. The rule of St. Benedict did not prescribe the exact method of drying rosemary, but its spirit of order and stewardship guided every step. A place for everything and everything in its place. A time for every task and every task done at its time. The garden itself rested in winter, but the infirmary did not. The same patient attention that in summer was given to the growing beds was turned inward, to the warmth of the hearth, the comfort of the sick, the quiet rhythm of care that did not cease when the growing season ended. And so the seasons turned, each bringing its own work, its own remedies, its own understanding of what the body needed. The monastic healer did not try to conquer illness with force. He worked with time, with patience, with the slow accumulation of knowledge that each season added to the last. He planted in spring, harvested in summer, stored in autumn, and gave in winter. And in giving, he completed the circle that the garden had begun. This quiet rhythm of readiness, of tending and waiting and trusting what the earth provided, would carry forward into the next age. But before that story unfolds, there is one more chapter to consider: the limits of this care, its failures and its blind spots, and how even the wisest infirmary knew when medicine could do no more. A wound on the body of a guest or a brother arrived first, not in the infirmary, but at the cellarer's hands. Water was brought, wine or vinegar if the wound showed dirt. The cleaning was slow, deliberate, repeated until the linen came away clean. Then the poultice would be made. Honey from the monastery's own hives was the base. It had been used since before anyone could remember, written in no book but passed from infirmarian to assistant across generations. Into the honey went ground comfrey leaf, a little yarrow, sometimes plantain that grew at the edge of the cloister walk. The mixture was spread on a strip of clean linen and laid over the wound, then wrapped with another length of cloth, not tight but firm enough to stay in place when the brother moved. The infirmarian worked by touch as much as by sight. Lantern light was poor in the side room where wounds were dressed, and the hours of the office did not wait for a bandage to be finished. He learned to work by feel, to know by the tension of the linen whether the wrap was even, to smell on the old dressing whether the wound was clean underneath. Monks were not permitted to perform surgery that drew blood. This was not a matter of skill but of rule. The body was lent by God, and the blood within it was not for a monk to release. So the boundaries were clear. He could clean, he could dress, he could apply poultice and plaster, he could counsel the patient to rest, to drink broth, to remain still. But if the wound required a cut, a stitch, the opening of a vein, he sent word to the barber surgeon in the nearest town, or to the itinerant surgeon who passed through the valley twice a year. The infirmarian knew his limits. That knowing was part of his craft. Fractures were another matter. A bone could be felt through the skin. The infirmarian would wash the limb, pull gently until the bone settled, and bind the break with splints of hazelwood wrapped in soft cloth. The patient was told not to move. The splints were checked each day. If the bone had broken clean and the patient was young, it healed. If it had shattered or the skin had broken through, the outcome was in God's hands, and the infirmarian's task was to keep the patient comfortable and the wound as clean as the room allowed. Dislocations were reduced with careful traction, sometimes using a linen sheet wrapped around the limb while another brother held the patient still. The joint would settle back with a sound the infirmarian learned to recognize. Then binding, rest, and the poultice of St. C. John's wort oil to ease the heat in the tissues. Burns came often from the kitchen, from the forge, from candles left too close to a sleeve. The treatment was oil, cool, not cold, applied on a clean cloth. Sometimes egg white was mixed in, sometimes the juice of the house leek that grew on the infirmary roof. The dressing was changed twice a day, and the patient was given water to drink in small sips. None of this was heroic. None of it was certain. What the infirmarian offered was not cure but care. He stayed with the patient, he changed the dressings, he prayed, he brought food that could be eaten with one hand. He sat in the quiet of the room and let the patient know he was not alone. The limits of monastic medicine were not failures of knowledge. They were the edges of a world that trusted more in the body's own recovery than in intervention. The infirmarian's tools could not cut deep, could not stop bleeding within, could not mend a fever that came from within. But they could hold a wound closed, keep a burn clean, ease a joint back into place, and offer a bowl of warm broth when the patient was afraid. When the next day came and the wound was still clean, when the brother could move his fingers, when the patient asked for food and ate it, the infirmarian would take down the old dressing, wash his hands again, and begin once more. And that was enough. That was what the Monastery Infirmary could do. On the shelf above his work table sat a manuscript of Remedies copied decades before by a brother whose name had been forgotten. The pages were worn at the edges, stained in places where honey or oil had touched them. The infirmarian did not open it every day. He knew most of its contents by heart. But sometimes, when a wound was stubborn or a fever did not break, he would turn the pages by candlelight, looking for something he might have missed, something a long-dead hand had written for him to find. Seasonal medicine was not simply a matter of what grew when. It was a quiet pact between the infirmarian and the turning year, a promise that when fever or cough arrived months later, something would remain of summer's abundance. Spring came first, and with it the young greens. The infirmarian would walk the garden at dawn, gathering nettle tops and dandelion leaves before they toughened in the sun. These were boiled into gentle tonics, set in clay cups on the infirmary shelf. The belief was that winter had thickened the blood, and spring greens would thin it again. Whether or not that was true, the fresh taste of the year's first harvest must have felt like medicine in itself. Summer was the busy season, and not only because there were more ailments. Warmth brought wounds that festered faster, and travellers arrived with sun headaches and dust-dry throats. But summer was also when the garden gave most freely. Lavender, sage, rosemary, and chamomile were cut at their peak and hung in bundles from the infirmary rafters. The dried stalks would later be steeped for teas, laid in linen pouches for poultices, or burned to sweeten a sick room's air. The infirmarian worked steadily, knowing that each string of herbs was a stitch in the fabric of the coming winter. Autumn brought a different kind of harvest. Roots were dug and scrubbed clean of cold soil. Barks were stripped from young branches and set to dry on wooden trays. Rose hips and hawthorn berries were gathered before the first frost softened them. The infirmary kitchen simmered with syrups and preserves, their sweetness masking the bitter earthiness of medicinal plants. Honey and wine became carriers for longer storage, drawn into small jugs and sealed with wax. The garden's abundance was slowly transformed into something the darkness could not reach. Winter in the infirmary was the quietest season, but also the most watchful. The garden lay still under frost. The dried herbs, once full of scent and colour, grew brittle and faded in their bundles. The infirmarian knew that stored remedies lost potency with each passing week. A lavender bundle gathered in July might soothe by December, but by February it was little more than dried stems and memory. This was the hidden danger of winter, not that illness came more often, but that the remedies prepared in trust and haste might not be enough when they were finally needed. And so the rhythm of the year turned in the monastery, not as a theory, but as a round of practical work. The infirmarian moved through it with hands and eyes, filling jars when the sun was high, trusting that the stores would hold, knowing they might not. The garden was planted in faith. The herbs were dried in hope, and the winter candle was lit each evening beside the clay pots and the folded linen, a small flame keeping watch over what remained. From those clay pots and fading bundles, the knowledge of plants would slowly travel beyond the monastery walls. The next chapter of medicine did not begin in a library or a lecture hall, but in quieter places, in the careful hand of a copyist, in the margins of a manuscript where a monk had written, "Probatum est." This has been tried. It was a quiet admission, made in the margins of manuscripts and in the empty beds of the infirmary. There were limits to what monastic medicine could do. No amount of prayer, no decoction of herbs, no careful regimen of rest could always hold back the tide of disease. The monk healers of the Middle Ages worked with what they had, and what they had was incomplete. They did not know of germs. The idea that invisible agents might pass from the sick to the healthy was not part of their world. They understood contagion in a broad sense, that proximity to the ill could bring illness. But the mechanism was a mystery. When a fever swept through a dormitory, or a wasting sickness took hold of a brother over months, the infirmary could name the humoral imbalance, but not the cause. They adjusted the diet, bled the patient, administered an electuary, and waited. Sometimes the body recovered, sometimes it did not. Bloodletting was one of the most common practices, rooted in the ancient theory that health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A fever meant too much blood, so blood was let. A sluggish constitution meant excess phlegm, so purgatives were given. The logic was internally consistent, but the treatment could be as dangerous as the disease. A patient already weakened by illness could be drained further, left pale and shivering in a narrow infirmary bed, the bowl of blood beside them growing cold. Purging followed the same pattern. Strong herbal laxatives, emetics, and enemas were prescribed to expel corrupted humors. The theory promised cleansing. The reality was often dehydration, cramping, and exhaustion. Medieval infirmaries did not have the tools to measure what they were doing. They had observation, tradition, and faith in the system they inherited. They applied these with sincerity, but sincerity does not always heal. Then came the epidemics. When plague arrived at a monastery, the infirmary became a place of last resort. The herbal remedies that worked for coughs and fevers did nothing for the buboes and the blackening skin. The prayers that brought comfort to a dying monk did not stop the next one from falling ill. In a matter of weeks, an entire community could be reduced to a handful of survivors, the infirmary filled with the dead and the dying, the garden of remedies standing useless in the sun. In the records of such times, the manuscripts often fall silent. There is a break in the chronicles, a gap when no entries were made. When the writing resumes, it is often in a different hand. The monastic healers understood their failure in spiritual terms. If a patient did not recover, it was because God had called them. If an epidemic swept through the cloister, it was a trial or a judgment. This framework gave meaning to suffering, but it also absolved medicine of the need to improve. Why seek new remedies if the outcome was already written? Why question Galen if nature itself followed divine order? But there were those who did question. Marginal notes in medical manuscripts record the doubts of individual healers, a remedy that did not work, a symptom that did not match the expected pattern, a case that defied the humoral model. These small acts of observation were the seeds of a later, more empirical medicine. They were planted in the very texts that preserved the older certainties. On the shelf in the infirmary, a manuscript might sit next to a jar of dried rosemary and a clay pot of honey. The book contained inherited wisdom, much of it wrong. The honey, applied to a wound, sometimes worked. The rosemary, steeped in wine, could ease the digestion. The Monastery Infirmary was a place where ancient error and practical remedy existed side by side, and the difference between them was not always clear. The limits of medieval care are not difficult to see from our vantage. But the men and women who tended the sick in those stone rooms did so without our knowledge, with tools that seem primitive, and with a faith that we may find hard to understand. They held the hand of the dying. They washed the fevered brow. They laid out the dead and prayed for their souls. That was medicine too, even when the herbs did not work. When the infirmary closed the door on an empty bed, when a remedy remained unopened on the shelf, when the garden lay dormant under frost, they accepted what they could not change. But they did not stop tending the garden. They did not stop copying the manuscripts. They prepared for the next patient, even knowing there would be another illness they could not cure. And that preparation, the quiet, stubborn continuation of care in the face of limit, carries us gently toward the next chapter, where the seasons turn and the remedies are stored away for winter, waiting to be used again. Medicinal wines, vinegars, and syrups. When the growing season ended and the garden beds lay covered with straw against the first frost, the infirmary still had remedies to draw upon. The work of summer was not only in the fresh picking, but in the bottles and crocks and jars that had been filled during the warm months and stored away on cool stone shelves. These were the preserved preparations, the wines, the vinegars, the syrups that carried the strength of the garden through the darkness of winter. Wine was the most trusted solvent in the monastic apothecary. It did not merely hold the flavor of the herbs steeped within it. Wine could draw out and hold the essential qualities of a plant in a way that water could not. A handful of wormwood, a sprig of rosemary, a root of elecampane set into good wine and left to rest for a fortnight would yield a medicine that kept for months. The alcohol preserved what would otherwise decay. The infirmary knew this from practice, not from theory. Each batch was tested by taste and smell, and by the color it took on as the weeks passed. A deep amber meant the herb had given freely. A pale tint meant more time was needed. Vinegar served a different purpose. It was sharper, more penetrant, and the monks used it to make oxymel, the ancient mixture of vinegar and honey that appeared in remedy collections across Europe. Oxymel was a base for syrups meant to soothe coughs and clear the head. The sharpness of the vinegar cut through the sweetness of the honey, and the herbs added their own voice to the blend. Hyssop, thyme, and licorice root were common additions. The result was stored in earthenware crocks, sealed with wax and cloth, kept in the coolest corner of the cellar where the temperature held steady through the turning of the year. Honey syrups were a third kind of preparation, and they required a different kind of patience. Honey alone never spoils, but it must be warmed gently to accept the infusion of herbs without burning or losing its own properties. The infirmary would set the honey in a small pot over a low fire, add the crushed leaves or petals, and stir slowly until the mixture thickened and the scent changed. Then it was left to cool, strained through a clean linen cloth, and poured into small clay pots or glass bottles if glass could be had. Glass was prized in the infirmary because it let the monks see the color and clarity of the preparation. A syrup gone cloudy was a syrup to be remade. Each batch depended entirely on the quality of what went into it. A poor harvest meant weak medicines. A damp season could ruin the potency of a plant before it ever reached the jar. The infirmary learned to read the garden not only at its peak, but in its decline, noting which plants had dried poorly, which seeds had not matured, which roots had split in the ground. These observations were kept in the mind, and sometimes scratched into the margins of manuscript pages. There was no laboratory, only the senses, and the senses were trained year after year until a monk could tell by the smell of a wine whether it had been properly made. The cellar where these preparations were stored was a quiet place. A single lamp burned on a stone ledge, casting a low light over the rows of containers. The air smelled of honey, dried herbs, and the faint sharpness of vinegar. In summer, the jars stood full and sealed. Through autumn and winter, they were opened one by one as need arose. The infirmary tracked each jar by memory and by marks scratched into the wax seal. A cross meant fever. A circle meant stomach complaints. A line meant a syrup for sleeping. This was not the work of a few days. The rhythm of preparation followed the seasons the same way the offices followed the hours. In late summer, the wines were set to steep. In early autumn, the vinegars were strained and the oxymel blended. Before the first snow, the syrups were sealed and stored. The infirmary moved through these weeks with the steady pace of someone who had done it many times before and would do it again. There was no urgency, because urgency led to mistakes, and a mistake in the cellar might not be discovered until a fever broke in January, and the jar yielded nothing but spoiled wine. These preserved remedies were not a substitute for the fresh garden, but they were its faithful companion through the cold months. When the garden lay silent beneath frost and the infirmary lamp burned late through a long night, the bottles on the cellar shelf held the memory of sunlight and soil and the careful hand that had gathered them. Beyond the walls of the men's monastery, in smaller cloisters, often hidden in valleys or at the edge of towns, the women's convents ran their own infirmaries. Quiet communities of nuns, living by the same rhythms of prayer and labor, grew their own gardens and tended their own sick. And in doing so, they held knowledge that rarely traveled beyond the cloister gate. The convent infirmary was a place of wool and warmth. The beds were narrower than those in the men's infirmaries, but the linen was often finer, stored with dried lavender and rose petals sewn into small cloth bags. The infirmarian, always a senior sister, chosen for her steady hands and calm disposition, kept her own cupboard of remedies: clay pots of honey for wounds, dried yarrow for fever, a ceramic nursing cup with a small spout, shaped so that broth or herbal tea could be given to a bedridden patient without lifting her head. These objects were not elaborate, but each one was made with care, and each one had a purpose born of long observation. The convent garden was smaller than the men's herb garden, but it was no less carefully planned. In a sheltered courtyard, protected from wind by stone walls that held the sun's warmth well into the afternoon, the nuns grew the plants they knew best: feverfew and chamomile along the edges of the path, sage, rosemary, and thyme in raised beds, borage with its bright blue flowers, used to lift the spirits of those weakened by illness. And always, in a corner where the soil was richest, a patch of lady's mantle, a plant whose leaves caught dew in perfect silver beads, and whose name alone spoke of the knowledge women passed to women. What these nuns understood about the female body was practical and hard-won. In an age when male physicians rarely saw their patients undressed, and when most medical texts were written by men who had never attended a birth, the women of the convents filled the silence with experience. They prepared infusions to ease the pains of labor. They knew which herbs helped a nursing mother produce more milk and which could calm a colicky infant. They brewed teas from raspberry leaf and nettle to strengthen the womb after childbirth. None of this was written in the great medical encyclopedias of the time. It lived in the hands of the sisters who had watched their own mothers, aunts, and grandmothers before taking the veil. The most famous of these women, and the one whose writings survived, was Hildegard of Bingen. In her stone cell at the convent on the Rhine, she filled page after page with observations on the human body, on plants, on the humus, and on the subtle relationship between the health of the soul and the health of the flesh. She described the body as a garden in itself, a living landscape that needed tending. She wrote of the womb as a field, and of the blood as a river. But Hildegard was not alone. She was simply the one whose work was preserved. How many other nuns, in how many other convents across the fields and forests of Europe, held the same knowledge in their memory, and passed it quietly to the next infirmarian when her time came? The women's infirmaries had their own rhythm. When a sister fell ill, she was wrapped in a woolen blanket and given a warm stone at her feet. The other sisters took turns sitting with her, reading psalms in a low voice or simply keeping watch by candlelight. The infirmarian checked the color of her urine, felt the warmth of her forehead, and chose a remedy from the garden. If the illness was serious, the sister was moved to a cell near the fire, where broth could be kept warm through the night, and the sound of the other nuns chanting Prime would reach her through the stone walls. The care was not only for the body. The convent understood that rest and silence were themselves medicines. A sister recovering from illness was excused from the night offices and allowed to sleep. She was given warm milk sweetened with honey. She was told not to worry about the work left undone. The garden would still be there when she was well. The copying and the weaving and the teaching could wait. The infirmary existed to hold space for healing, and it did so without hurry. But the limits of medieval medicine pressed against these walls as surely as they pressed against the men's monasteries. Childbirth remained dangerous, and the nuns could not always save the women who came to them from the surrounding villages. Fevers took the young and the old alike. Infections set into wounds that had seemed minor. The herbal knowledge of the convent was real and valuable, but it was not magic. It was observation and tradition, tested by time, but without the tools we would later take for granted. Antisepsis, anatomy, a proper understanding of infection. What the nuns could offer was presence, cleanliness, warmth, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had watched the body heal and watched it fail and learned the difference. And so the convent infirmary runs on quietly in our imagination. A small room with a wool blanket folded at the foot of the bed, a clay pot of honey on the shelf, a wax tablet on which the infirmarian has noted who is unwell and what she has given them. The garden outside is in shadow now, the herbs silvered by moonlight. In the morning, the sisters will walk the rows again, and the knowledge of the body, of the earth, of the quiet work of care, will continue as it always has. In the next chapter, we will follow this thread further and step into the village itself, where those who had no cloister built their own remedies from hedgerow and hearth. The garden did not vanish when the monasteries dissolved. It scattered. Seeds were carried away in pockets and pouches. Plants rooted themselves in cottage gardens and university plots, and the pages that described them found new readers in a world that was learning to ask different questions of nature. The legacy of monastic medicine is not a museum piece. It is still growing. Many of the plants that monks tended in their infirmary gardens remain listed in pharmacopoeias around the world, though the reasons for their use have shifted. Sage, rosemary, fennel, betony, feverfew. These were not abandoned when the old books were set aside. They were tested, refined, and reclassified. The monastic herbalist might have believed that a plant worked because of its signature, some visible sign placed there by a divine hand. The modern pharmacist asks instead about active compounds, clinical trials, and measured response. But the plant itself is the same one that grew in the long shadows of the cloister wall. The texts survive too. The illustrated herbals that monks copied by candlelight are now held in libraries, where conservators turn their pages with gloved hands. Some of these manuscripts are studied not only for their illustrations, but for what they reveal about how knowledge moved across centuries. A drawing of a plant in a 12th century manuscript may have been copied from a Roman source, passed through Arabic translations, annotated by a scribe who grew the same plant in his own garden. The chain of transmission is long and full of small transformations, but it is still traceable. The idea of institutional care for the sick, the notion that a community has a responsibility to shelter and treat those who cannot care for themselves, passed from the monastery into the early hospital. Not all at once, and not without change. The infirmary became the ward. The monastic rule became the hospital charter, and the charity that monks extended to travelers and pilgrims became the principle that medical treatment should not depend entirely on wealth. The architecture changed, the tools changed, but the underlying shape of a place set apart for healing remained recognizable. Monasteries also left a quieter legacy in the realm of routine. The structure of the monastic day, regular meals, scheduled rest, periods of quiet, cleanliness maintained as a discipline, was not designed as medical treatment, but it created conditions in which recovery was more likely. Physicians in later centuries would codify these things as convalescent care, as the importance of sleep and nutrition and hygiene. But in the monastery infirmary, they were simply part of the pattern, as natural as the bell that called the community to prayer. The plants that monks gathered and dried and stored in clay jars were not always the most effective remedies. Some were useless. A few were harmful. But the act of gathering itself, the impulse to prepare for winter, to know which leaf to reach for and when, represented something the medieval world did not have a name for. A systematized approach to treatment, grounded in observation and tradition, passed down through practice rather than through theory. In the quiet of the scriptorium, a scribe copying a medical text might pause to add a note about a plant he had seen growing in the meadow beyond the monastery wall, a detail that had not been in the original manuscript. That small addition, that moment of personal observation, is one of the ways in which medical knowledge grew. Not in great leaps, but in margins. The legacy of the monastery infirmary is also visible in the gardens that still surround old hospitals, in the herb beds planted in city parks, in the renewed interest in botanical medicine, among those who find modern healthcare too hurried or too fragmented. The garden that once supplied the infirmary shelves now supplies something less tangible but no less real, a connection to a slower kind of care, one that did not separate the body from the season or the patient from the place around them. What the monasteries left us, more than any single remedy or text, was the assumption that healing belongs in a setting of calm, that the room matters, that the presence of quiet, order, and attention is itself therapeutic. We practice this assumption every time a hospital designs a garden for patients to walk in, every time a sick room is arranged with care for light and air. The origin is seldom named, but it is there. And in the winter dusk, when the last herbs hang drying in the darkness of an old stone room, the scent of them is still the scent of a knowledge that did not end when the monastery closed its doors. It found other hands, other gardens, other shelves. And it continues quietly in places where someone still knows which leaf to reach for when the season turns. The Monastery Infirmary and the Garden of Remedies. To understand what was lost, you have to imagine the garden not as a plot of ground, but as a living document. Each plant had been gathered, named, dried, pressed into folios, and planted again the following spring for centuries. The same lavender that grew in the infirmary border in the year 1100 was still being propagated in 1530, its lineage unbroken, its properties recorded in manuscripts that monks had copied and corrected and sometimes illuminated with careful drawings of the very same leaves. The garden was a conversation across generations, and the dissolution of the monasteries ended that conversation in a matter of years. When the commissioners arrived, they came with inventories and orders. The libraries were the first to be scattered. Manuscripts that had taken decades to produce were pulled from their shelves, stripped of their bindings for the gold and silver in the clasps, and sold by the cartload to bookbinders who used the parchment as stiffening for new covers or as wrapping paper. Medical texts that contained the accumulated observations of 6 centuries of infirmary practice were torn apart for their margins. Some were taken into private collections where they sat unread. Others simply rotted in the rain. The gardens fared no better. Without the monks to tend them, the physic gardens were left to the weather. The precise layouts that had been designed so that the infirmarian could walk from woundwort to feverfew to Bethany in a logical sequence were trampled by livestock or ploughed under for grain. The walled enclosures that had sheltered tender plants through the winter fell into disrepair, and the frost killed what the plough had spared. The varieties that had been selected and saved for their potency were crossbred or choked out by wild plants or simply forgotten. A living library that had been curated since before the Norman conquest was erased from the ground in a single season. What survived did so because it had already begun to move beyond the monastery walls. The first printed herbals, produced in the decades before the dissolution, had copied directly from monastic manuscripts, and these printed books found their way into the hands of apothecaries and householders who could read the vernacular. The knowledge that had once belonged exclusively to the infirmarian was now available to anyone who could afford a printed book. But a printed herbal is not the same as a garden. The drawing of a leaf cannot teach you how the plant smells when bruised, or how it grows in shade versus sun, or which parts to gather at which phase of the moon. The printed word preserved the names, but not the touch. In the empty gardens, the herbs that had been brought from distant monasteries, cuttings carried by travellers, seeds traded for prayers, reverted to their wild forms or vanished entirely. A plant that had been cultivated specifically for its medicinal properties, selected generation after generation for the strongest leaves or the deepest roots, could lose those qualities within a few years of neglect. The genetic memory held in the soil was as fragile as the memory held in parchment, and unlike parchment, it left no trace of what it had contained. The buildings themselves were repurposed or dismantled. Infirmary halls became barns, sheep pens, or quarries for dressed stone. The herb drying lofts where lavender and sage had hung in fragrant bundles were left open to the birds. The still rooms where the infirmarian had distilled rose water and compounded salves were stripped of their copper vessels and left to crumble. The small graveyards where generations of monks and travellers had been buried, often with medicinal herbs planted over their graves, were ploughed level and sown with crops. For nearly 300 years, the monastic medical tradition was a ghost. Its books sat in the libraries of collectors who could not read them. Its gardens were fields of wheat. Its medicines survived only in the hands of village women and cunning folk who had learned from the monks and passed the knowledge along in quieter, humbler ways. The loss was not total, but it was deep. What had been a coherent system of care, rooted in a specific place and sustained by a daily rhythm of cultivation and attention, became fragments scattered across a landscape that no longer remembered how to assemble them. When the gardens were finally rediscovered by archaeologists and historians in the 19th and 20th centuries, the ground was asked to give up its secrets. The outlines of beds were traced as crop marks in dry summers. Pollen grains preserved in buried soil layers revealed what had been growing where. The ghost of the garden was found again, but a ghost is not the living thing. The names could be recovered. The layout could be mapped. The smell of damp earth and drying herbs and warm broth that could only be imagined, and only at a distance. The dissolution did not destroy everything. Some knowledge had already crossed the walls before they fell. And in the centuries that followed, that knowledge found new homes in printed books, in domestic practice, in the herbal gardens of apothecaries and physicians who had learned, in their own way, the same lesson the monks had known all along. That the best medicine begins with attention, with patience, and with a garden planted in the right place at the right time. That quiet inheritance leads us forward toward the next chapter of this long and winding story, where medicine began to leave the monastery altogether and find its way into the streets and houses of the growing towns. Winter herbs hanging in the dark. The monastery at night was a different world. The corridors fell into shadow, the last prayers had been sung, and the only light came from a single candle burning in the infirmarian's quarters. Outside, the garden lay quiet under the cold air, the beds bare, the soil resting until spring. But inside the storeroom, the summer's work still hung in bundles from the rafters. Dried herb bundles swayed slightly with each draught that moved through the stone corridors. Yarrow hung beside chamomile, sage next to mint, and each bundle had been cut at the right moment, tied with linen thread, and hung in the dark to preserve what strength remained. The infirmarian knew every bunch by sight, by smell, by the way the leaves crumbled between the fingers. This was not decoration, this was the pharmacy. The storeroom held more than dried stems. Jars of syrup lined the shelves, dark liquids that caught the candlelight. Clay pots held salves made from beeswax and steeped oils. A small mortar sat on the table, still dusted with pale powder from the afternoon's work. Every shelf, every jar, every bundle was a memory of a plant that had grown, been harvested, and been transformed into something that might help when the next fever came. And the fevers came with winter. The cold months brought coughs that rattled through the dormitory, slow healing wounds that refused to close, and the deep ache of joints that had worked too long in damp fields. The infirmarian moved between the beds with quiet steps, feeling foreheads, adjusting blankets, offering sips of warmed broth. There was no cure for most of what ailed the sick, but there was presence. The infirmary itself was a long room with a low ceiling, its walls whitewashed and its floor swept clean. A fire burned at one end, not so hot as to stifle, but steady enough to keep the chill at bay. The beds were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses covered in linen that smelled of lavender and sun. Each patient had a cup, a bowl, and a small stool beside the bed. The window looked onto the cloister garden, though at this hour only darkness reflected back. The infirmarian checked the fire, tucked a blanket higher around an old man's shoulders, and paused at the window. Beyond the glass, the garden was barely visible, just the faint outline of the stone wall and the bare branches of the apple tree. In spring, it would bloom again. The herbs would push through the soil, the bees would return, and the cycle would begin once more. But for now, everything waited. Monastic medicine was never about heroic intervention. It was about the small things that added up to care. A warmed stone wrapped in cloth for cold feet. A cup of tea made from thyme and honey. A hand to hold during the long night. The infirmarian did not promise to heal. He promised to stay. And in a world where illness was mysterious and death was a neighbor who visited often, that promise was worth more than any remedy. The manuscripts that recorded these practices were themselves fragile things, copied by candlelight, their margins worn by generations of hands. They described herbs by their appearance and their uses, sometimes mixing accurate observation with older beliefs passed down from Roman and Greek writers, whose authority was rarely questioned. A plant that resembled a body part might be prescribed for that part's ailment. A root, shaped like a tiny man, might be gathered at midnight under a particular phase of the moon. Some of these practices worked, or seemed to. Others were harmless at best. A few were dangerous, though the monks did not always know it. But the tradition carried forward not because every remedy was effective, but because the act of tending mattered. The garden was planted each spring because it had always been planted. The herbs were dried and stored because the winter would come and the sick would need them. The manuscript was copied because knowledge, even imperfect knowledge, was better than ignorance. The infirmarian returned to his desk and sat down. The candle had burned low, and he trimmed the wick with a small pair of shears. On the desk lay an open ledger, its pages filled with notes in a careful hand. Names of patients, symptoms, treatments given. A record of what had been tried and what had not helped. The ledger was not a scientific document in the modern sense. It was a diary of care, written by someone who was doing his best with what he had. He closed the ledger and stood. The fire needed another log. The herb bundles swayed gently overhead as he passed through the storeroom, their shadows dancing on the walls. He chose a bundle of dried chamomile and brought it to the infirmary, placing it near the fire, where its gentle scent would fill the room through the night. Outside, the wind moved through the empty garden beds. The soil was cold and hard, but beneath the surface, the roots of the perennial herbs were alive, waiting for the season to turn. The monastery's work was never truly finished. It moved in cycles, like the planting and the harvest, like the prayers that marked each hour, like the steady flame of the candle that burned through the night. If the herbs lost their strength and the manuscripts grew illegible, what remained was the tradition itself, the willingness to sit with the sick, to offer what comfort could be offered, to refuse to turn away from suffering even when no cure existed. That thread ran through the centuries, from the first infirmaries of the early monasteries to the quieter corners of modern medicine, where the same simple acts of presence still matter more than any drug. The candle flickered. The monastery settled deeper into the dark. The herb bundles hung in the rafters, fragrant and patient, holding the memory of summer until spring returned. And in the morning, the infirmarian would rise before dawn, light a fresh candle, and begin again. This tradition of quiet care, built from gardens and manuscripts and small acts of kindness, would outlast the walls that housed it. It would be carried in the names of plants still used today, in the layout of hospital wards that echo the long infirmary hall, in the understanding that medicine is not only about what is prescribed, but about who stays by the bedside through the night. The garden sleeps now, but it has not disappeared. Its roots hold, its seeds wait, and when the light returns, the remedy will be planted again. The monastery gardens did not last forever. In the 16th century, the dissolution of the monasteries in England and across parts of Europe brought an end to centuries of accumulated knowledge. The great libraries were scattered. Manuscripts that had been copied with painstaking care by generations of scribes were lost, burned, or left to rot in attics. The gardens, those ordered beds of lavender, sage, feverfew, and comfrey, were abandoned. The walls crumbled. The paths were overtaken by nettles and brambles. The living collection of medicinal plants, passed down not in books, but in the hands of gardeners who knew each herb by touch and taste, was gone within a single generation. What survived did so in unexpected ways. Some knowledge had already passed out of the monastery gates into the hands of householders who copied remedies into their own books. Vernacular herbals, printed for ordinary people rather than for scholars. Preserved fragments of the monastic tradition, a recipe for an oxymel for a cough, a note on how to dress a burn with honey and plantain leaves, a drawing of a plant with its name written in plain language. These humble books carried the tradition forward, even as the great libraries lay empty. But something was lost that no book can replace. The monastery garden was not only a collection of useful plants, it was a living encyclopedia, organized by season and by use, tended by people who had watched it for years and knew how a dry spring affected the mint, or which corner of the wall sheltered the chamomile from the wind. That kind of knowledge does not survive in manuscript. It lives only in the hands and the attention of the gardener. When the garden was abandoned, that attention ceased, and the memory of those particular plants, in that particular soil, under that particular sky, vanished. And yet the winter storeroom tells a quieter story. Even in the last years of the monastery, when the dissolution was approaching and the community was shrinking, the infirmarian would have carried on his work. He would have checked the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. He would have tasted the syrup of roses to see if it had kept through the cold months. He would have visited each bed in the infirmary, adjusted a blanket, refilled a cup of water, sat for a moment with a patient who could not sleep. These were not dramatic acts. They were the daily routines of care that no decree could dissolve. The herbs hanging in the dark, the bundled yarrow, the dried mint, the tied stems of feverfew, they held the memory of summer. Their scent had faded. Their color had drained to brown and gray. But their presence in the storeroom was a kind of promise. They said that someone had prepared for winter, that the garden would be planted again, that the chain of attention had not broken. The herbs would be used, and when they were gone, the gardener would remember where they grew and would go back to the same bed in the spring. If you walk through the grounds of an abandoned monastery today, you may still find plants growing that do not belong to the native landscape. A clump of lavender where there should be no lavender, a patch of comfrey spreading along a ruined wall, rosemary growing wild near a foundation stone. These are the ghosts of the old gardens. They have survived without the gardener's hand, persisting in the soil long after the beds were forgotten. They grow and bloom and seed themselves, generation after generation, carrying the memory of the garden in their roots. The monastic tradition of healing did not end because it failed. It ended because the institutions that housed it were dismantled. But the impulse at the heart of that tradition, to stay with the sick, to offer what comfort the world could provide, to tend the body and the spirit together, did not disappear. It scattered, like the pages of the old manuscripts, into 1,000 smaller places, into the homes of householders who kept a pot of aloe on the windowsill, into the practice of village women who knew which herb to steep for a fever, into the hands of anyone who has ever sat beside a sickbed through the night, not because they had a cure, but because they could not leave. That is perhaps the deepest legacy of the Monastery Infirmary. Not a single remedy or a specific text, but the understanding that care is not primarily about solving a problem. It is about presence. It is about staying. The infirmarian checked the fire, not because he thought the fire would heal anyone, but because a cold patient could not rest. He changed the linen, not because the linen was a medicine, but because clean linen was a small dignity that a sick person still deserved. He sat in silence not because he had words of comfort, but because silence itself could be a comfort when no words were enough. The garden at night is very still. The herbs hang from the dark beams, their dried leaves brushing against each other in the movement of air that comes through the old walls. The embers in the infirmary fireplace glow faintly. The candle burns low. The patient sleeps or does not sleep, and the infirmarian watches. This scene has repeated itself countless times in countless monasteries across centuries that no one counted. It is not a story of progress or discovery. It is a story of ordinary attention, offered day after day, night after night, without record and without reward. And so the closing image is simple. The monastery is quiet. The garden is dark. The winter herbs hang in the rafters, and the snow falls on the ruined walls. But somewhere, in a small room that still has a roof, a candle burns. Someone sits beside someone who is ill. They have water. They have a cup. They have a few dried herbs that may help or may not, and they stay. That is the medicine that cannot be dissolved. That is the remedy that no garden can grow and no fire can extinguish. It is the quiet attention of one person to another, in the dark, without knowing the outcome. The winter infirmary lay quiet under a low sky, the kind of deep quiet that only settles in when the snow has muffled every outer sound and left the world to itself. Inside the stone walls, the air was warm and still, scented with dried lavender, sage, and the faint bitter edge of wormwood hanging in bundled sheaves from the rafters. The infirmarian moved slowly between the beds, checking that each linen was clean and folded, that the pillows lay straight, that the small wooden cup beside each cot held fresh water. There were no patients tonight, but the discipline of preparation mattered. A guest might arrive at any hour, footsore and feverish, sent up from the village by the priest or brought by a neighbor who had seen the light in the chapel window. And so the beds were made, the fire was banked, and the herbs were ready, because the monastery had always been a place of refuge, and refuge meant readiness. The infirmarian paused at the small ledger on the shelf near the window. His fingers traced the columns of entries, each one a name and a complaint and a note of what had been given. Some entries were short. A traveller with a cough, given honey and horehound, rested 3 days, departed well. Others went on for weeks, tracking the slow recovery of a brother who had taken a fever in the autumn, or the careful nursing of an old lay worker whose joints had seized with the cold. The ledger was not a medical record in the modern sense. It was a book of attentions, a chronicle of small kindnesses. And behind each name was a story the infirmarian carried in his memory. The way the man had looked on arrival, the sound of his breathing, the day his appetite returned. Above the ledger, tucked into a leather pouch, lay the seed packets saved for spring. The infirmarian took them down and weighed them in his palm, feeling the dry rustle of paper and the faint promise within. Here were seeds of feverfew, which the old text said could calm a pounding head. Here were seeds of chamomile, whose tiny flowers would fill the garden with a scent like apples and bring sleep to the restless. Here were the dark, flat seeds of poppy, which the infirmarian handled with respect, knowing their power and their danger. The garden was the heart of the infirmary. In the growing months, the beds outside the south wall were thick with leaf and blossom, and the infirmarian would walk among them each morning, clipping what he needed, checking which plants were thriving and which needed more sun or less water. He knew each one by its leaf, by its smell, by the time of day it was best gathered. He knew that some plants must be picked at dawn when the dew still lay on them, and others at dusk when the day's heat had released their oils into the air. This knowledge was old, passed from one keeper of the garden to the next, sometimes written down in the margins of prayer books, sometimes spoken in the ear of a new brother as they walked the paths together. The garden gate stood at the far end of the cloister, a simple wooden lattice overhung with the dead vines of last year's honeysuckle. In summer it would be alive with bees, but now it was frozen shut, the latch glazed with ice. The infirmarian did not try to open it. He simply stood and looked out at the white humps of the raised beds, knowing what lay beneath the snow, knowing that the roots were waiting. This patience was part of the work. The garden taught it. You could not force a plant to grow. You could only prepare the ground, sow the seed, and trust that the season would turn. So too with healing. You could not command the body to mend. You could only create the conditions for mending and wait. The infirmarian turned back to the fire, which had burned low while he stood at the window. He added a log, careful not to disturb the embers, and watched the new flames catch and spread. The fire was the third center of the infirmary, after the beds and the garden. It was never allowed to go out, not even in summer, because the fire was not only for warmth. It was for decoctions and infusions, for simmering roots until their virtue entered the water, for heating stones that could be wrapped in flannel and laid against a cold chest, for boiling the linen that must be clean. The fire was the engine of care, and the infirmarian tended it as carefully as he tended the sick. The practice of monastic medicine was older than the buildings that housed it. Long before the first monastery rose in the valleys of Europe, the desert fathers had gathered medicinal plants and tended one another in illness. When the great monastic orders spread across the continent, they carried with them not only the liturgy and the Latin texts, but also a deep practical knowledge of herbs and healing. Every monastery was expected to have an infirmary. Every infirmary was expected to have a garden. And every garden was expected to supply what the infirmary needed. This was not a matter of theory. It was a matter of survival. The monastery was often the only place within a day's journey where a sick person could find shelter, warmth, skilled attention, and medicine. The villagers knew this. The travelers knew it. The monks themselves knew it, because they too fell ill, and they too depended on the infirmarian's knowledge. The infirmarian who walked these corridors in the deep of winter stood in a long line of men and women who had done the same work in the same way for centuries. The plants he used were the same plants that had grown in monastery gardens since the time of Charlemagne. The methods of drying and storing were the same. The rhythm of the day, the prayers that marked the hours, the quiet attention to the sick, all of it came down through generations of practice, each infirmarian learning from the one before, each adding something of his own observation and passing it on. There was a shelf in the infirmary where the manuscripts were kept, not the grand illuminated volumes of the scriptorium, but practical handbooks, some copied by hand from older books, some written in the infirmarian's own careful script. These were the herbals. They described the plants of the garden and the uses to which they might be put. They were not systematic in the modern sense. They did not isolate active compounds or measure doses. They told stories. Yarrow for wounds, because the plant's feathery leaves resembled the feathers of an arrow, and nature was believed to reveal its purposes through signs. Lungwort for coughs, because its spotted leaves looked like diseased lungs, and the creator was thought to have marked each plant with the likeness of the ailment it was meant to heal. This was the doctrine of signatures, and it shaped the medicine of the monastery for hundreds of years. The infirmarian did not question this doctrine. He had seen too many things work to doubt the patterns. He had seen a man with a festering wound grow well under a poultice of yarrow and honey. He had seen a woman with a dry cough find ease from a tea made of lungwort leaves. He did not need to know why it worked, only that it did, and that the garden had provided what was needed. There was a humility in this approach that modern medicine sometimes forgets. The infirmarian did not believe he was curing anyone. He believed he was assisting the body's own power to heal, providing the conditions and the materials, and then stepping back. The body did the heavy work. The garden supported it. The infirmarian was a steward of both. The monastery infirmary was not only a place of treatment, it was a place of teaching. Younger brothers would come to assist, learning the names of the plants, the proper time to harvest, the way to prepare an infusion or a decoction. They would learn to watch a patient's face for signs of change, to listen to the cough and know whether it was deep or shallow, to feel the pulse and judge its strength. This knowledge was not written down in any syllabus. It was passed from hand to hand, from eye to eye, in the quiet of the infirmary. The teachers were the patients themselves, whose illnesses revealed what the books could not convey. As the centuries passed, this knowledge began to move beyond the monastery walls. There were several reasons for this. The dissolution of the monasteries in some parts of Europe scattered the monks and their learning. Many infirmarians found themselves in the wider world, offering their skills to villages and towns. Their herbals were copied by secular physicians. Their garden plants were cultivated in cottage gardens. The remedies that had once been reserved for the monastic community became part of the household medicine of ordinary families. A woman in a village might grow feverfew by her door, just as the infirmarian had grown it in the monastery garden. She might make a tea for a feverish child, using the same plant in the same way the monks had used it for generations. This transfer of knowledge was not a single event. It happened slowly, over decades and centuries, as the borders between monastic and lay medicine grew porous. The physicians of the emerging universities read the herbals that had been copied in monastic scriptoria. The barber surgeons who tended the wounds of soldiers and laborers learned from the practical experience of the infirmarians. The apothecaries who set up shops in the growing towns stocked the same herbs that had once been gathered from the monastic garden. The lineage was direct, even if it was not always acknowledged. The infirmarian in his quiet room could not have predicted this. He did not know that his careful notes would one day be studied by scholars, that his methods would be absorbed into a system of medicine that would spread across the world. He only knew that the fire was warm, the beds were ready, and the seed packets in their leather pouch held the hope of another spring. And that was enough. That was the whole of his vocation, to be ready, to be present, to care for whoever came. The garden under the snow was not dead. It was resting. The perennials had drawn their strength down into the roots where the frost could not reach them. The annuals had dropped their seeds into the soil, where they would wait for the warmth that would come, as it always came, in its own time. The infirmarian understood this cycle as deeply as he understood the rhythm of the prayers. There was a time for growth and a time for dormancy. There was a time for action and a time for waiting. The winter infirmary was a place of waiting, of preparation, of the kind of quiet attention that could not be hurried. He checked the guest bed one last time, smoothing the linen with his hand. He refilled the water cup. He added another log to the fire, and then he sat in the chair by the hearth, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes on the flames. The night stretched ahead, long and dark, but the infirmary was warm, and the garden was safe under the snow, and the seeds would wake when they were ready. There was nothing more to do but wait, and to be here when the door opened. The infirmarian's mind drifted to the old stories, the ones that were not written in any book, but were told in the refectory after supper, when the brothers gathered in the last light of the candles. There was the story of the brother who had been found unconscious at the garden gate, carried in by the porter, his body burning with fever. The infirmarian at that time had not known what to do. He had tried everything in the garden, everything in the manuscripts, and the brother had only grown worse. In desperation, he had taken a handful of common yarrow, the plant that grew wild in the ditches beyond the wall, and made a poultice. He had laid it on the brother's chest and prayed. By morning, the fever had broken. The brother had opened his eyes and asked for water, and the infirmarian had written in the margin of his herbal, beside the entry for yarrow, a single word: "It works." There were many such stories, and each one was a thread in the fabric of the tradition. The infirmarian did not think of himself as a scientist or a physician. He thought of himself as a gardener. His patients were the soil, the plants were his tools, and the healing was a harvest that came when the conditions were right. This was not a metaphor. It was the literal truth of his practice. He grew the medicine. He prepared the medicine. He gave the medicine. And then he trusted the body to do what bodies had been doing since the beginning of time, which was to mend. The wind picked up outside, rattling the wooden shutters. The infirmarian rose to check them, pressing each one closed, ensuring the warmth of the fire would not be wasted. Through the crack between the shutters, he could see the garden, silver and still under the moon. The snow had covered everything: the paths, the beds, the gate, the low wall where the rosemary had grown in a thick green hedge. In the spring, he would find the rosemary again, its woody stems pushing through the thawed earth, its needles releasing their scent when he brushed them with his hand. For now, it slept. Sleep was also a medicine. The infirmarian knew this better than most. The body healed fastest in sleep. The mind settled in sleep. Even the plants seemed to draw something from the darkness of the winter nights, storing energy for the burst of growth that would come with the light. The infirmary was designed for sleep, with its thick walls that held the warmth, its small windows that let in the morning sun but kept out the cold, its deep quiet that wrapped around the sick like a blanket. Many of those who came to the infirmary needed rest more than they needed any remedy. The infirmarian gave them permission to rest, which was sometimes the hardest gift to accept. The relationship between the monastery and the wider practice of medicine was complex and deep. The monasteries did not invent medicine, but they preserved it. When the great libraries of the ancient world were scattered, when the works of Galen and Hippocrates and Dioscorides were lost to the secular world, they survived in the copying rooms of the monasteries. The monks who copied these texts did not always understand what they were copying. They did not need to understand. Their task was fidelity, to reproduce the words exactly, to preserve the knowledge for a future that might have more use for it than the present did. And the future did. When medicine reawakened in the universities of the later centuries, the texts that the monks had preserved became the foundation of the new learning. But the monasteries contributed more than preservation. They contributed practice. In the monastery infirmary, theory met the real body, the real illness, the real limits of human knowledge. The infirmarian could not afford to be dogmatic. He could not tell a patient that the text said one thing while the patient was failing before his eyes. He had to adapt. He had to try what the text suggested, and, when it did not work, to try something else. This pragmatic tradition, the willingness to observe and adjust, was as important as any remedy the garden produced. It was the beginning of what would become clinical medicine, the careful watching of the patient and the willingness to change course. The infirmarian knew nothing of this historical weight. He knew only that the yarrow had worked for Brother Anselm and that it might work again for whoever came next. He knew that the chamomile tea his predecessor had taught him to make was good for a restless stomach. He knew that the lavender he hung in the rafters made the air of the infirmary easier to breathe, especially for those who lay long in bed. These were small certainties, hard-won, deeply held. They were enough. The fire crackled and settled. The infirmarian looked at the seed packets one more time before tucking them back into their pouch. Feverfew, chamomile, poppy, and a dozen others whose names were written in the careful hand of the infirmarian who had held this office before him, and before him, and before him, back through the centuries to a time when the monastery was new, and the garden was only a patch of turned earth behind the chapel. Each packet was a link in the chain. Each seed carried the memory of every harvest that had preceded it. The infirmarian would add his own packets when the new seeds came in the spring, and the chain would continue. The door to the infirmary did not open that night. No traveller came, no brother was carried in, no child was brought by a desperate mother. The quiet held. The fire burned. The herbs dried in the rafters. The garden slept. And the infirmarian, when the bell for the night office rang, rose from his chair by the hearth and walked to the chapel, his steps slow and steady, his mind already turning toward the morning, when he would check the garden gate again, and the seed packets, and the ledger, and the fire, and the clean linen, ready for whoever might come through the door. Dawn arrives at the monastery, not as a sudden event, but as a slow unfolding, a gradual lightening of the grey stone walls. The infirmarian has been awake for some time already, long before the first birds began their tentative calls from the orchard. He sits at his wooden desk in the small chamber adjoining the infirmary, a tallow candle still burning low beside him, though the light from the window has begun to overtake it. Before him lies the ledger, its pages filled with careful entries in a hand that has grown steadier over the decades. He reads back the last lines, recording which brother rested poorly through the night, which traveller was given a warm posset for a cough, which herbs were dispensed and in what measure. The ink is dry. He closes the ledger. The infirmary room itself is quiet and still. The beds are arranged along the walls, each one covered with a simple linen sheet, neatly folded at the foot. The floor has been swept clean. A single window faces east, and the early light falls across the stone floor in a long, pale rectangle, illuminating the dust motes that drift slowly through the air. The room smells of dried lavender, of beeswax, of the faint earthy scent of the clay pots that line the shelves. There is no urgency here. There never is. The infirmarian moves through the space with a practiced calm, checking that each bed is ready, that the water jugs are full, that the fire in the small hearth has been banked properly and will last through the morning. His work is not about dramatic cures or sudden interventions. It is about readiness, about having the right thing at hand when need arrives. He opens a small wooden cabinet built into the wall and examines the jars and pots stored there. Each one is labelled in his own hand. Some contain dried leaves, tightly crumbled and dark. Others hold roots that have been carefully sliced and dried in the warmth of the kitchen. There are petals preserved in honey and seeds wrapped in linen packets, each one tied with a length of twine. He checks the seals. He notes which supplies are running low and will need to be replenished when the garden has given its full abundance. It is the garden that calls him now. He takes down a key from a hook beside the door and steps outside. The cloister is still in shadow, but above it the sky is a pale and gentle blue, streaked with the thinnest clouds, lit from beneath by a sun that has not yet cleared the wall. He walks the short path to the gate of the physic garden, a gate made of simple wooden slats, greyed by weather. The lock turns easily. The gate swings open without complaint. The garden is a world unto itself. It is not a large space, but it is arranged with care. The beds are raised and edged with stone, and each one contains plants that serve a purpose. Here grow the feverfew and the chamomile, low and spreading, their leaves soft to the touch. There stands the sage, its leaves a muted silver green, and the rosemary, woody and fragrant. The lavender has not yet bloomed, but its grey-green stems promise what will come. The mint has spread further than it was meant to, as mint always does, and the infirmarian makes a mental note to trim it back before it overtakes the time. He walks the narrow paths slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. The dew has settled on every leaf, and the air is cool and clean. He stops beside a patch of yarrow, its feathery leaves still wet, and crouches to examine the new growth at the center of the plant. It is doing well. He moves on. Near the far wall, the foxglove stands tall and still, its bells not yet open, but the stalks are strong. He regards it with a quiet respect. It is a plant that demands attention and care, and he gives it both. In the corner of the garden, sheltered from the wind by the stone wall, is the small patch where the poppies grow. They are not yet in flower. Their leaves form a low rosette against the dark soil. The infirmarian pauses here a moment longer. He knows what they will bring when the time is right, and he knows the care that must be taken with them. The garden does not judge. It offers what it offers, and the skill lies in knowing when to gather and how to prepare. He returns to the gate and looks back at the garden before closing it. The sun has begun to warm the tops of the walls. The birds are fully awake now. The day has begun in earnest. He locks the gate and walks back toward the infirmary, where the room is ready, the supplies are checked, and the quiet work of the day awaits. Brothers will come with aches that have kept them from sleep. Travelers will arrive at the gate with complaints of the road. The infirmarian will listen, and he will open his cabinet, and he will prepare what is needed. Not with haste, but with care. Not with certainty of cure, but with certainty of attention. The ledge is closed, the seeds are safe, the gate is shut. The room waits, clean and still, as it has waited every morning for longer than anyone now living can remember. And the infirmarian takes his place beside the window, where the light falls steady and calm, ready for whoever may come through the door. And now the candle gutters. The embers fade. The room grows dark, and the long night settles over the monastery grounds. The garden will grow again in the spring. The herbs will be gathered. The remedies will be made. But for now, there is only rest. The deep, unbroken rest of a world that has laid down its work and asks nothing more of you than to close your eyes and let the quiet hold you. Sleep well.